Being an old punk rocker, I'm quite impatient. I'm not going to hold my tongue if I think something needs saying.
Having dead animals put on your gatepost or death threats, what is it that keeps you going?
I don't feel disempowered. Very often it's been David versus Goliath, but that doesn't scare me. What gets me out of bed in the morning is the smell, of an oak woodland when it's just finished raining in the autumn. It's the first hoot of a tawny owl on a cold October evening. That's the seed, the source, the fuel that drives that need to communicate that passion and enthusiasm as rapidly as possible because of the problems it faces.
Chris Packham is a conservationist and broadcaster known for his environmental and animal welfare activism, and he's also a vocal advocate for neurodiversity. You've obviously had this very intricate and deep connection with the natural world in so many forms throughout your life. I was wondering if we could go back a bit, and you could tell me a bit about your kinship with animals as a child, as a teenager, how that happened for you.
I was an avid collector of living animals as a child, so there were always things in jam jars and tanks in my bedroom. And then latterly, they were enclosed in cages in the garden. But when I got to about 12, my father bought me some binoculars, and it transformed the way I, interacted with those creatures, because I realised I could learn a lot more about them when they were living in their habitat rather than my bedroom. And from that point onwards, I became less interested in keeping animals and more interested in watching them out in the wild, basically.
Do you feel like your autism drove you in some ways to make those connections, or even enabled you to form deeper connections with the natural world?
I think I was drawn to it because of my ability to see things in great detail very rapidly and remember them. And I suppose we call it focused interest now, but I asked it with obsession. I had an obsessional interest in natural history, and it would ricochet from one species or group of species to another. And therefore, if you like, and certainly not, I don't want to be in any way immodest, I would sort of develop a degree of expertise about a very small number of things, but in intense detail, very rapidly. And the greatest joy of my life, as it's been through, broadcasting, is that I get to meet people who know more about any part of that subject than I do. And they're put at my disposal to ask them questions, and they tell me what they know. It's the University of Natural Sciences, and that's been the greatest joy. People very often think, oh, it must have been brilliant to have travelled and seen all of those species that you probably never dared dream you would, flicking through secondhand copies of Nat Geo in 1966. That's true, but then meeting the scientists that know more about them and them telling me that the latest discoveries in terms of their research is even better, to be quite honest with you.
How would you encourage other people who maybe are autistic, have ADHD, or other forms of neurodivergence to think about their experience of the world?
Well, I think it's about focusing on, as ever, about the opportunities and attributes that you might have rather than just the challenges and difficulties. I've never really been satisfied unless I can totally immerse myself in any experience. I'm not very good at superficial. So, you know, I can identify, as most people can, a tree by its shape. You can identify a tree by its leaves. You can identify a tree by, its bark, the pattern on its bark. But I can identify trees by the sound that rain makes on their leaves if I'm sat underneath them with my eyes closed. That's not a tremendous skill. Anyone could learn that. But that's the sort of degree that I want to engage with nature. And what we find is scientifically and across the spectrum, outside of the neurodiverse community, and that is that the more that we focus on any individual part of nature, if we are in that space, then the more rewarding it will be in terms of reducing anxiety, stress, and so on and so forth. And the longer that reward will last. I come into the garden where I'm speaking from now, and in springtime I listen to song thrushes singing here. I've managed to reshape the garden by allowing it to become a bit more natural. And now there are sufficient snails here to have brought a couple of song thrushes in. That I measure as a very small, of course, personal conservation success, but it's also somewhat selfish because I come out here of an evening and I listen to the song thrush singing. and it brings me no end of joy. I learned recently, and it's one of the things that has titillated me of late, is that some research that scientists have done looking at zebra finches found that when they're learning their song, um, that they it gives them pleasure. Basically, they get a dopamine hit. When they perfect their song, they get a bigger dopamine hit. So they like singing, but when they get it right, they feel even better. A bit like us in the shower, I imagine, or me battering through some old Clash classic, and occasionally I might sing in tune and feel slightly better about it. So I love the fact that birds are essentially making themselves happy by singing. What I love even more is that when that song thrush sings in my garden on a chilly evening in spring, I get a dopamine hit. So that happiness crosses the species divide, and ultimately, you can't beat that. Good bit of science, good bit of connection.
Yeah, all species trying to uplift each other in a way. So you're obviously not afraid to speak out for what you believe in and to stand up for the natural world, but you've also faced a backlash because of that activism. Could you tell me a bit about that?
Well, I mean, I guess like many people, I'm trying to ask, a significant part of the population to change its mind and habits a bit more quickly than it feels comfortable to do so. Humans, as we know, are remarkable animals. We're, intelligent, adaptable, creative, imaginative, innovative. I could go on. We're brilliant in many ways, but we're not very good at changing our minds. And at this point, it's very clear that unless we do change our minds and therefore our practices, we're going to be in even deeper trouble than we are already in. So, and a tiny minority will push back in an aggressive and violent way. But ultimately, it doesn't mean they're right. I've never picked a fight because I thought I could win it. I've always picked my fights because I thought they were the right fights to pick at the time. So very often it's been David versus Goliath, but that doesn't scare me because for me, winning isn't about crossing a line, getting a medal, climbing out of a ring, having won a bout. Winning is about not giving up, and that at this point in time is the thing that people of my ilk, activists, campaigners, protesters, need to hold closest to their hearts. It's very difficult at the moment. It's very, very difficult. We're being persecuted, through an unjust legal system in terms of public protest in the UK. We're up against the terrible things which are happening in the United States and other parts of the world when it comes to, reining back on environmental protection legislation and indeed environmental sciences. So these are tough times, but look, ultimately, I think we are a wonderful species. I think that we have tools, technology, energies, and abilities at our disposal to make sure that we can adapt to the problems we've already generated and reduce those that we don't need to make in the future. We've just got to get on with it. And being an old punk rocker, I'm quite impatient as well. So I'm not going to hold my tongue if I think something needs saying.
I mean, I think it's not often realized, though, among the general population, what you have put up with, and I hope you don't mind me saying, but, you know, having dead animals put on your gatepost or death threats or explode, all of these things are really, what is it that keeps you going in the face of actually what is a very challenging affront to the work that you do?
Well, my sister has one take on it, and she says, you were bullied as a kid, and that was in the classroom. You're now bullied by the right wing press, and you kind of got used to it, and you don't care. And I genuinely, I don't care. It's not that I don't read it. I always do read it because I also have to be in a position where I need to retain the right to change my mind if I'm proved wrong. Actually, I always find that quite exciting. Actually, and ultimately, I don't have a choice. I got involved in this job because I have a very strong underlying vocational interest, and now through my lifetime I've seen and charted so many of those catastrophic declines and the rise of so many problems which can be addressed. I don't feel disempowered. There are a lot of great scientists out there doing great things to figure out what the problems are, devise methods to address them, implement, trial and test those methods. It's just that we don't have anyone out there with the gumption to roll them out broadly enough and rapidly enough to make a difference. So I've got to help drive that.
And it seems that increasingly those people who are standing for that, and you touched on this before, that in the UK, for example, peaceful protest has become increasingly hard to do. People are being arrested and imprisoned for acts of civil disobedience. Why is this happening? Where is this coming from, do you think?
Fear. I think that's what it is, really. I think sometimes it's a lack of vision. I think sometimes there's definitely corruption. Um, but I meet a lot of politicians, obviously principally here in the UK, occasionally in Europe, who are, I would say, intrinsically, good public servants, and they've sought election because they want to make a meaningful difference, and they share, along the lines that I've voiced, a vocational ideal in terms of making the world a better place for whatever their cause happens to be. But I'm afraid that those that seem to rise to the top of the pile lose sight of what they really should be doing. I mean, who would have thought that we could have elected a Labour government headed by a former human rights lawyer, overseen by Yvette Cooper, who I admired so greatly when she was in opposition, speaking in the House of Commons, a very eloquent, clever, intelligent woman, who are now, presiding over the crackdown on protests that we're currently seeing. What's happening there? I think, to be fair to politicians generally, their job is never easy. A 5-year term of office is not a lot of time to make a meaningful difference, particularly if the coffers are empty, and they are certainly empty at this point in time. But nevertheless, I think that we should be expecting more of our public servants. We are fortunate in the UK to have a democratic capacity to vote for those people. Um, I think we should have the democratic right to go back to them and say, we voted for you, but you're not doing what we wanted you to do. So please think about this. And here's the evidence. And in a way, many of the protests that we see, the peaceful protests that I'm advocating, that is their purpose. I'm very scared, if you want to know. I think history is a not so distant mirror, and we look at some of the draconian laws, impositions, and behaviours that we're seeing from governments around the world at the moment. They reflect some of the behaviour that we saw in the last century, and it didn't go well. So I'm pretty scared.
What's the single biggest action the UK government could do to put the brakes on climate change or biodiversity loss?
Well, I look. I mean, they've got a great person in that department of energy and net zero with Ed Miliband, but he hasn't got enough of his fingers in the treasury to be able to spend the money and make the investments that he needs to make so that we can have that just transition away from a dependence on fossil fuel and invest significantly in renewables. That's what I
Mm.
mean. I think there are people out there who can and want to do a good job. But we need to act far more rapidly. And when we see conversations taking place about third runways, and we hear about, potentially again going back to Rosebank oil field and Blackbird oil field, all we can do is look at those leaders and think of insanity, because, again, there is, you don't have to be a reader of New Scientists, to recognise what the problems are. They are now widespread and well known. All of this is sounding like bad news. I'm talking about a lot of problems here. There are a lot of opportunities when it comes to engineering at the moment, engineering science, renewables. Look at China. Again, I read it in New Scientist magazine. China is spending more on research, development, and implementation of renewables than every other country in the world. We should be investing in that. We should be building those ultra thin, highly efficient, and cheaper solar panels. But once again, we're missing a trick because, under the extraordinary lobbying power of the fossil fuel industry, our government is still talking about carbon capture nonsense and potentially drilling for more oil and gas.
And what's your issue with carbon capture specifically?
I'm very interested in developing it as a technology. As again, me, I'm at the forefront of science. I love all of those things. Not my field, of course. I don't have any expertise there, but we need to make sure that at this point in time we're focusing on our endeavours on systems that will be sustainable going forward. We live in a windy, wet, and a wavy place. So we should be implementing those renewables in the UK as rapidly as possible. It all sounds very cynical, but look, I need to bring us back to the point. All of these things sound like problems. We've got to start focusing on opportunities.
You recently launched a petition to end fossil fuel advertising, and I feel like you were touching before on some of those vested interests and how influential they are. I mean, do you see fossil fuel advertising as a major barrier to action on climate change?
Well, in the UK, fossil fuel companies actually don't spend too much money on advertising in the grand scheme of things, but they spend it in a very targeted way, and they target, decision makers, politicians, and others. But what I do see is the sponsorship that we are increasingly seeing in sports. So my petition wasn't just about advertising; it was also about sponsorship, and to me, this is just a way of them legitimising, what they do. It's normalising their business, and their business has no right to be normal anymore. It's enormously destructive. It's destroying our planet. There's no ambiguity about it, and again, we don't need to have that discussion. So when I see millions, billions of pounds being paid to sports sponsorship, so that it subliminally ekes its way into people's lives, and they see those companies as doing something advantageous, supporting something which people have a keen interest in, i.e., sport. That's not right. I mean, the idea that British cycling is sponsored by Shell. It's like a bad joke. You couldn't make it up, could you? Cycling, something which we do, which is healthy, which combats carbon emissions from some vehicles. We do it for pleasure, for mental health, for physical health, and it's sponsored by a company which is basically killing the planet. Oh, come on. That's just insane. As is, I have to say, the continued, acceptance of sponsorship within some of our, public scientific institutions like the Science Museum, and the British Museum, who still take money from fossil fuel giants and allow them editorial to control when it comes to shaping their exhibits, which are seen by millions of young people. It's brainwashing, and it didn't ought to be allowed.
Absolutely. And so what does a sustainable future on Earth look like to you? You talked about, how we need to be optimistic, and there are so many paths which, we can be optimistic about. What, do you have a sense of what that might look like in 10, 20 years' time?
It's very difficult, obviously, to look into a crystal ball, given the advances in technology and now the very rapid advances that we're looking at when we see climate breakdown. But I think we need a change in mindset. Firstly, growth. Everyone goes on about growth. Growth comes at the cost of consumption, and when we live on a finite planet. So again, it's quite embarrassing when when you hear principal political parties and world leaders talking about economic growth after economic growth after economic growth based upon consumption. I mean, again, I worked with my campaign to ban fossil fuel advertising and sponsorship with a group called Badvertising, because advertising is a very powerful tool. It shapes our desire to consume. And does that consumption really make us happy? Whether you're into walking in the woods with dogs, whether you're interested in, healthy food, whether you're interested in art, singing, dance, whatever it happens to be that excites you in life, it doesn't have to come at the cost of, you know, accumulating loads of stuff. I remember my dad saying when I was a kid, a Timex tells the same time as a Rolex. And I think you pretty much hit the nail on the head, really.
Yeah, yeah. You can have a good life without overconsumption. I really believe that. And what, other mindset shifts that you think we need to embrace? I mean, I've seen you've written, I think maybe for us before, even about whether people should be having fewer children. Is that an issue that you still believe in?
You have to be very careful when we're talking about, essentially overpopulation, because we have to look at population in connection with consumption. And you know the figures. Everyone in Western Europe uses 1.5 Earths a year in terms of resources, and America uses 4 or whatever it is. I can't remember the precise analogy there, but it's something along that level. So how can that possibly work? Well, that only works because of the resource poverty of other people in the world who are underusing, the world's available resources. And so I'm, a very firm believer that when it comes to addressing climate breakdown, whatever it happens to be, all of these issues, biodiversity loss, population, we have to be looking at a far greater degree of equality there. You know, um, And at this point in time, one of the most embarrassing thing about the COPs is obviously their inability to do anything meaningful and for people to meet the targets that they agree. But every time we have a conference of the parties, they fail to agree to significantly subsidise the poorer countries in the world who are suffering most from climate breakdown. I can't do anything more frankly disgusting, to be quite honest with you. And again, it's that sort of pervasive greed which is the handicap. So I think moving towards equality, and that's not just on a global level, but of course that's in the UK as well, is incredibly important. I mean, look, we've elected a Labour government, and you know, who would have imagined that they would have you ended up doing U-turns about disability payments, winter fuel allowance, and potentially in the future they're even talking about educational care and health plans. When really what we all want them to do is slap a 2% wealth tax on everyone with more than 100 million and solve the problem. Simplistically, the disparity between the number of billionaires and the number of people that can't even afford to put food on their plate is giving us a significant problem. So
Mm,
wealth redistribution in true Robin Hood fashion is something that we need to do on a global scale. And that's just bringing us back to population. Again, it's what we do know is that when women are properly educated, emancipated, if you like, and given the equality or closer to the equality that they obviously need, deserve, and must have, then typically they do have fewer children. And as a consequence of that, the quality of their children's lives and futures may well be enhanced. But
mm.
I hate it when people start wagging their finger at sub-Saharan Africa and start. I mean, that's sort of flagrant, vile racism doesn't cut it with me, I'm afraid. The problem is here in Europe and the United States, we're consuming too much. It doesn't matter how many of us there are. We're using up too much stuff.
Thank you. Yeah, climate justice seems to be a necessary step towards any kind of action on climate change. I wanted to just move on and talk a little bit about your upcoming BBC TV series, which is about evolution. Is that right?
Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. And when's that set to air? Is that coming out soon?
It's going to be after Christmas, at least. So we've got one more day of shooting with me and the poodles, actually, because we didn't look at it just sort of chronologically, as the textbooks for A levels might have done in the 1970s and 80s when I was studying. We chose sort of a topic. So we did the evolution of intelligence, the evolution of locomotion, the evolution of feeding. Um, and we were looking for sort of surprising and quirky, stories and analogies in science that would prick people's ears up, and move far beyond sort of Mendel and Darwin. So the poodles are involved in locomotion, gait, basically, how they walk, how they trot, how they run. So we look at the mechanisms, and again, it's been a great opportunity to include as much new science as we possibly can. I did pinch one or two stories from the magazine as well, by the way.
Yeah, it's definitely one of our favorite beats. Evolution obviously took places over innumerable generations, billions of years. What can humans take from that perspective about their place within nature?
Well, firstly, how lucky we are to be here. I mean, the chances of human life evolving, which infinitesimally small, and very often evolution comes down to serendipity. Such things happen unpredictably. Um, Mutations obviously can be unpredictable, but the fact that they occur in a place where they can actually succeed is odd. So when you look at, even if you look at the recent, hominid family tree, um, it's just bizarre that we're here, to be quite honest with you. Evolution doesn't necessarily take those millions of years. We see evolution happening in the garden behind me. Since 1970, the great tits that inhabit my garden have grown longer beaks than those on continental Europe, because we in the UK have a greater habit of feeding birds in our gardens, and they've grown those beaks a little bit longer so they can reach into feeders. The blackcaps that visit my garden have shorter wings than they did when I was a kid, because they are no longer migrating to Iberia. They're basically birds that come here in the winter from Germany, because it costs them less energy, and the milder climate means that they can winter here and then get back to the best breeding territories on mainland Europe. So, evolution will respond very rapidly to a change in resources, and particularly if there's a change in resources where there's a lack of competition, and then things will explode. And again, that's we've looked obviously in the series at a number of mass extinction events which have occurred throughout, as we know, throughout the history of life. Um, and they always are presented as catastrophic. Meteorite takes out all the dinosaurs, disaster. Wow, might have been a disaster for the dinosaurs, but hey, we mammals had a great time in the aftermath, and in the immediate aftermath of that, there was an extraordinary explosion of mammal fauna on Earth. All of those niches which were previously unavailable, mammals evolved to fill them, um, and of course, all of that is tremendously exciting. So, at the moment, we're precipitating, I would argue, an extermination rather than an extinction event, since it's us that's driving it, and we need to get our language right. But whatever we do to the planet, life's tenacity will mean that it will survive, and it will be beautiful, maybe even more beautiful all over again.
Yeah, I think it's often not realized how such an active, yeah, or how active evolution is over these shorter time spans. And, I guess humans in particular must have had such a large role in shaping life on Earth in recent centuries, given all the changes that we've enacted. Do you think that also gives us a responsibility to guide evolution in the future, or get involved in more? Yeah, I mean, I guess there's been a lot in the press recently about colossal, for example, and genetic engineering. Or what's your kind of perspective
Yeah,
on
yeah,
that?
yeah. The magazine did a feature about that recently, about De-extinction and Colossal, the company that claimed to have, you know, recreated dire wolves. The scientists are quite scathing about that. So what Colossal have been doing effectively is using grey wolves, and they've given them a few genes that make them a little bit more look a little bit, perhaps. I mean, they're not even adult yet, the animals which they've produced, but now they're talking, as I read in the magazine, about producing a species of moa, an extinct bird from New Zealand. I mean, look, I agree entirely with the sentiments of your contributors. I'm interested in this. Um, my concern varies slightly in that, it's not only Colossal, the company, it's the colossal amounts of money that are going into it. And I think getting the balance between that blue sky science and also protecting the species that we've already got is something that we need to think about and reconcile. I'd certainly like to have my hands on some of the many millions that are being spent on those sorts of projects. But listen, if they did recreate a thylacine, Tasmanian tiger, which became extinct in 1936, obviously I'd want a ticket to see it. I mean, that's it, isn't it? That's how they're continuing to prosper with these projects. But I think, again, as the magazine makes clear, Colossal have a vested interest in generating publicity about this sort of de-extinction process, because they have other business ideals when it comes to genetics, many of which may be useful, by the way. So again, rather like the contributors to your magazine, I'm entirely slagging Colossal. I'm just sort of saying that they're not really doing what they're saying they're doing. And did they ought to be doing it? Well, I wish they'd give me and my mates some money to look after some of the species that are in real trouble at the moment, and we could certainly put that to good use.
Thank you. We've got to sign off soon, but I just wanted to ask if there was any evolutionary adaptation you learned about on the series that blew your mind.
Evolutionary adaptations that I blew my mind. I'll tell you one of the giveaway facts, but it will spoil it, and I'll probably get told off by the BBC. So basically, we looked at the evolution of feeding, and when animals first started to feed, they would ingest the resource into parts of their body in a vesicle, and it would close, and they would digest it. And when it was digested, they would reopen that vesicle, that bubble in their skin, in really simple terms, if you like, and then they would egest it. It would go out. And that was a relatively inefficient way of doing things. So what happened was that animals, started to ingest food, and it would go in one end and then go out the other. So they eventually they had a gut, basically, and that meant that they could eat continuously, because you didn't have to close it and digest it and then egest it, and it meant that you could specialize with parts of that gut. So essentially, what you've got then is you've got an animal which has got a mouth where the food goes in, and you've got an anus where the food goes out. Now, quite clearly, you want to get the food in the mouth. So that's where you want to put your sensory organs, those organs which are responsible for finding the food. And so that might be your nose, and it might be your tongue for taste, or whatever organs you're using to chemically sense, and it would certainly be your eyes. So what we see then is that when you've got essentially you've got a mouth, a gut, and an anus, the sensory organs gravitate towards the mouth, and effectively what you get then is a head. And so when you think about the evolution of the head, it only happened because we had an arse. So unless we had an arse, we would never have evolved a head. And it's very childish, but I quite like that because it explains to people the very simple nature of the form and function of life. Because everything I've told you makes plain common sense, doesn't it? But many people won't have looked at a simple animal, maybe like a flatworm or something, which is, got a very simple head, simple sensory organs, and then a gut and an anus at the other end, and sort of thought, yeah, that's why its eyes and the sensory organs are at that end, because it's got to find the food. That's why it's got a head. And of course, when those animals continue to evolve, that's why we end up as we are. That's why our eyes, our nose, our ears, and our tongue with its sensory organs are all at this part here, because they're at the front end of our gut. And that would not have happened unless we had an arse.
I think that's a wonderful place to leave this. Thank you, Chris.